Hello and welcome to another episode of Tacklebox Talks. I'm your host, Adam Martin from the Australian Recreational Fishing Foundation. Firstly, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the FRDC, the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation, and also ARF's member organisations that are from state organisations, peak bodies, and national peak bodies that represent rec fishing. Tonight's episode is a really good one. We're talking about how can we improve the rec fishing in the Murray Darling Basin. This episode's close to home for me as being a former boy from Kumiala in Central Asia. And tonight we get to speak with Dr. Lee, I hope I get this right, Baumgartner from the University of Charles Sturt Uni in Albury. So let's get to it. G'day, Lee. How you doing?
I'm good, Adam. How are you?
Not too bad, mate. Lee, tell us about yourself. What's your experience and what kind of work do you do?
Oh, what do? Gee, I started my number one. I'm a fisherman. I love fishing, and I've fished ever since I was a kid, and that led me into a pretty amazing career working on freshwater fish all over the world. I started my career in '99. That's when I finished uni, and I was given a job with this team of blokes who were working out of Cronulla, out of this fishery centre. And I turned up on the first day I worked Monday, and they said, we're going electro-fishing. And at that stage, I had no idea what electro-fishing was. And we spent 14 days out bush in this big boat, zapping fish, all sorts of fish that I'd never seen, and I was hooked. And since then, I reckon I've sampled fish from almost every single river in New South Wales. It's taken me to the Mekong. I've worked on rivers in Germany. It's been a pretty amazing career. So a love of fishing has led to a pretty lifelong, passionate career for me. I've been pretty lucky.
Awesome. So this tonight's episode's pretty close to a lot of people. Murray Darling Basin, freshwater. Of all the water on the world, freshwater only makes up 3%, and nearly 2% of that is underground. So 1% of the world's fresh water is on the surface of the earth. And Australia just hasn't got much of it. Mark Twain comes to mind back from the late 1800s, where he said, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And, more than 40 odd years later, we're still arguing over our water supply. So let's get to it. Murray Darling Basin. What can we do to improve the situation?
Oh, my goodness. So if I look at the Murray Darling Basin from a fish perspective, the last 300 years has been a pretty ordinary time to be a native fish. It's got to the stage now where native fish are less than 10% of what they were pre-European levels. We've seen collapses of the commercial fishery. We've seen recreational fisheries decline, and we've got a pretty high rate of fish that are now endangered or threatened, and a lot of that's due to basically due to the way we've developed our rivers and the way we manage our water. It's really tricky. We've seen pretty big explosion of population across the basin in the last 50 years. We've seen conditions get drier, and we've seen more and more competition for water. And what can we do? Wow, there's so many things that we can do for fish. But the one thing that I'd love to see more of is one way I think we can help fish is by getting more and more people to recognise that fish are important and that fish are worth caring about, and that we should be devoting funding and resources towards them. And I just don't think there's enough of that.
So. Yeah, when it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and that's where we have such a hard time getting recognition, don't we? Having that recognition. Citizen science. That's a great way I can see that we can really promote and elevate fish's status in fresh water. So what can we do in citizen science and rec fishers working together in that area? What can we do?
There's so much we can do. There's citizen science is probably something that hasn't really been on the radar across the Murray Darling I'd say for the 20 years I've worked there, it's been talked about, but something that's always been put in a too hard basket. But having lived in the basin for the last 20 years of my life, one thing I can say that a lot of people do on their weekends is they go fishing. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're an irrigator. It doesn't matter if you're a real estate agent or a farmer or whatever. You go fishing on the weekend. And so people are always interacting with their fish. And there's lots of stuff we can do to make sure that when people are out there on the river, they're doing stuff that gives us usable information. So, I mean, we can talk about all sorts of things, but you know, one thing that's pretty close to my heart is tagging and getting fishermen involved in tagging programs.
Tell us about that. What's involved with the tagging in freshwater?
Oh, there's, I mean, it's gone back for decades, people tagging fish to work out different aspects of information of a fish's life. There was a guy back in, I'd say probably the biggest tagging program in the basin was published in 1983 by a bloke called Fred Reynolds. And he, in the late 70s, he tagged about 14,000 fish down in Berry in South Australia.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And he let them go. And that was the first ever tagging study, just those normal, you know, the bright yellow spaghetti tags that you have hanging out of a fish. And for the next few years, he collected all the tags that fishermen called in.
Yep.
And he found that some fish went up and some fish went down. But he also found that there was at least one yellow belly that went all the way up to the Condamine River in Queensland.
Yeah, right.
On the back of some big floods. And so just calling in information off those little yellow dart tags can give us huge amounts of data of what fish are doing, and fishermen play a big role in providing that information.
So tagging. What about if we were to paint an area here? We've got 300 fishers with 300 boats dotted all over Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, and Southern Queensland. And if we created a program where they used like an app, and they did like an interstate competition or 12-month competition, they put these fish on a brag mat. They submitted those through that app. What would that data be helpful for tracking fish through the basin?
Well, there's already a few programs underway that do that. There's, you know, things like bass catch and things like that have been recording angler catches for years. Now, it helps to a point to know how big a fish grows and where you've caught it. There's probably a lot of that information around. What we don't know is what fish do after the anglers release them and until they catch them again. You know, that's the thing. You catch a fish, you interact with it for a few seconds, you get it back in the water as quick as you can. So we've done a lot of work putting microchips into fish. And so sort of between 2003 and 2013, we microchipped around about 42,000 fish in the Murray Darling and tracked their movements around. And we've found some pretty amazing information out of that. But that's one role where I reckon anglers could play a huge a role in terms of citizen science, is because, you know, we're putting these microchips into fish. They're going around everywhere. A lot of these fish are being caught by fishermen. They probably don't even realise they've caught one. And so this stuff you can do on a boat. You could put an antenna on a brag mat. You could put an antenna on a bucket or a live well or anything like that. You could hand out little handheld beepers to fishermen that could tell when they've got a fish. Now that's when the data starts to get really useful, because if you've got hundreds of anglers who are bringing that data in at a regular basis, you start to put together a pretty good picture of what's going on very quickly.
Right. Let's move on. Dams and weirs. This is talked about a lot. And pause on the water buyback. Tell us about that. Like, I come off I was raised on a vineyard in Kumiella, and I know the water rights my parents had there, and flood irrigation with furrows. But that's been 25 years since I've seen that. What's the situation now with water and weirs and dams?
Well, I mean, we could go back to why it's a problem first. And, you know, fish need to move. That's one inherent thing that all fish do. It doesn't matter if you're a little fish or a big fish, you've got to move. And fish are moving. They can move to feed. A lot of fish move to spawn. It's seasonal annual spawning migrations. They could be moving to get away from bad water or all sorts of things. As soon as you stick a dam or a weir in, it blocks that migration pathway for fish, and they stop. And so in the basin itself, there's over 14,000 barriers to fish migration that need to be. That's something that's only popped up sort of in the last 100 years, most of those have been built. And so that we've seen huge declines in the last 100 years just because fish can't get to where they need to go to. But that's one aspect. The other aspect, and I guess we're going to talk about it tonight, so we might as well start talking about it now, is the Darling fish kill that happened a few years ago. Now, there's a weir that was one of the last sources of water on the Darling at the time, and so there was a stack of fish in that weir pool. A stack of fish in that weir pool. You get a massive blue-green algae event. You get stratification where the top water gets warm and the bottom water gets cold.
Yep.
No oxygen in the bottom. It flipped over. It killed millions of fish. And so you get this situation as well where the weirs are creating unnatural conditions in the weir pool. That wouldn't have normally happened in the Darling. You wouldn't normally have, in the middle of a hot, dry spell, a huge body of water held behind a weir. And when it goes bad, it goes bad. And that's what happened, what we saw in 2018, 2019. And that was probably, as a fish, someone's passionate about fish, that was the toughest assignment I've ever done. Not only from the fish perspective, but when you go west and you talk to the people who live on the river, they interact with that river every day. They know that when the fish are dying, the river's not in a good way. No. It's not. So the people who live on the river were just as heartbroken as us scientists and the fishermen. That no one wants to see a river that's virtually dead.
It's just a not great state of affairs. So more environmental flow. That's what we need to happen for a start.
Well, it's one thing. You were talking about water buybacks before, and that's been the main mechanism under the basin plan to try and bring more waters back to the river. And there's an ongoing argument about how much water is enough and how much water do you need. And when we got to that situation in 2018, 2019, we saw the Darling stop flowing, and it had been stopped flowing for a pretty long period of time. But there was and we saw those events that happened in the weir pool at Menindee. Upstream of the Darling, there was no water at all. There were big chunks of the Darling you could walk on. It was bone dry. And so never before in my career have I said this river absolutely desperately needs more water. It needs more water. And there was, at the same time, the Darling the McIntyre was trickling up the top. It was trickling. None of that was getting down. It had stopped flowing well before Burke and just started to dry up. So environmental flows are good under those conditions because they provide fish a lifeline, and they can also stop the blue-green algal events from happening. But what they can also do is when you get rain again, that's when the river bounces back, and that's when the fish spawn. So you need the flows to sustain the fish when the river's dry, but you also need the flows to give the cues for fish to spawn so they can recover from these events.
Yep. So. I know climate change and in our human limited lifespan of 80 odd years, and we have a hard time grasping climate change. It takes that long to happen. If we lived for 500, probably noticed the change, could recall them. But with climate change, and I'm no expert, our more extreme events of longer droughts, longer periods without rain, or it goes the other way, with much more intense rain events. You think with climate change and getting our climate to come back to a bit of a balance where it should have been 100 years ago, we would see more regular rain in the system?
Well, the challenge is, even if there was more regular rain, what we found was when the river dries up, that's when things get things get nasty, because you've got people who need water, just to drink, to bathe in, to wash. We saw that Menindee Township had to have its water shipped in because it just wasn't even enough, and they couldn't guarantee the quality of the water under that. So when there's water and when it's raining, there's not so many problems. It's when the water becomes limiting and everyone's competing for it. That's when you hear that, that's when the whiskey's for drinking and the water's for fighting, because there's just not much of it around. And then the environment needs it, the farmers need it, the towns need it, and that's where we need to get better at sharing it when there's not much of it.
Yeah, I think, well, it was only today I remember watching, I think it was on TED Talks, about how farming is significantly changing. Yes, we're going towards vertical farming and using much less water, but we still haven't got the kinds of farming like wheat or the grains and that require broad acre style farming, and that still uses a lot of water. So in Australia, I can see, and I've noticed there, very senior people in government and scientists said our style of farming is going to shift in the next 30 odd years because we have to. So hopefully, with that change in farming, see better allocation of water.
Well, that's one thing. Yeah,
Yep.
I'd also love to see a change in the way we store and distribute our water. I mean, we've got dams and weirs in parts of the Murray Darling Basin that have huge evaporation rates. Now you look at Menindee, the amount of evaporation off the Menindee lakes themselves is huge. The amount of evaporation off a still weir pool is huge.
Yep.
The amount of evaporation off a ring tank that's a storage on farm is huge. Other countries are dealing with this. I mean, if you look at China are starting to put things like floating solar panels on their still water storage, and they say that with every square meter that's covered with solar panels, they save a megaliter a year.
A megaliter.
Now imagine
a megaliter.
a megaliter a year.
Wow.
For a square meter, just in evaporation.
So that's one Olympic pool per square meter.
So it's a lot of evaporation.
Yeah.
So you have to. Some of the evaporation is huge. You got to think some of these. I mean, the figures from India are phenomenal, and that's one of the reasons why they drop it so quickly. So, if you were to use some of the private storages and put solar panels on them, which is what other countries are doing, they're seeing savings in the water, but they're also creating renewable energy. It just seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? But we're a little slow to adopt those sorts of things.
We get there eventually.
We do.
Let's go to.
But the good thing is, other countries are doing it and they're proving it works.
Yeah. That's it. We're what do we call it? We're the late adopters.
The late majority.
Late majority. That's right. Let's talk about translocation and the big Murray Cod that we've seen being moved from one spot to another. Tell us about that. Do they survive? Do they fight with the others, or is there breeding happening? Do we know anything about that?
That was a bit of a situation. It's like, what do you do? You've got a pool full of cod that are seriously distressed, and that are probably going to die if you don't do something. So a lot of the actions were taken to move those fish and translocate. Now some of them were translocated to hatcheries, and they did fine. They were good. They bounced back really quickly. Some of the fish were translated into translocated into other parts of the river, and it's a funny thing with Murray cod because we don't quite know, or haven't seen any data yet on how well they've gone, and hopefully they did survive. But Murray cod they're a big fish. They have a home range. They defend their home range, and one of the cautious things is when you're moving big fish around, is if you just plonk a big fish that's pretty sick into a home range of another fish, it might just get beat up. That's what happens. I mean, you wouldn't do it with a pride of lions in Africa. You wouldn't move a pride of lions into where another pride of lions are. That's what happens when predators get into the same area. So it's just one thing you got to be cautious about. So if you know you're moving fish to a safe area where there's no other fish and it's good, secure water, by all means do it. But you really have to put a lot of thought into the programs. But sometimes you don't get a lot of time to plan either.
No, not. You can see it when that happened there a couple of years ago. It was a quick decision to do or die. So,
I mean, that was a phenomenal response to that.
Yeah.
I mean, the government response, but also the public response. Some would say, well, it probably shouldn't have got to that stage in the first place. But when it did get to that stage, people were raising money for aerators. I mean, there were people running their irrigation pumps to aerate plumes, and you could see all these fish swimming around plumes. That no doubt saved fish. And a single Murray cod could produce 60 to 100,000 eggs. You got a yellow belly that can produce 300,000 eggs, and so if you get them through the tough period, they can bounce back quickly. But you've got to get the conditions right. And one thing that worries me about the Darling is that even since 2018-19, We still don't have the conditions right, and that's two. Well, I mean, this week is the 2-year anniversary of the last fish kills, and the Darling's still not flowing like we're used to seeing it.
Crazy. Let's move on. Fish ladders and screens. Can you tell us a bit about what's the go there with the fish ladders and the pump screen?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things I've been doing is working on this fish ladder technology and helping migratory fish. And I was pretty lucky from 2013 to 2003 to 2013. There was a Sea to Hume project, which was probably the biggest fish ladder project ever, where they built fishways at every weir on the Murray. So it reconnected Lake Alexandrina all the way up to Lake Hume.
Wow!
And so when they turned the bolt on the last structure, which was 2012, and that was the first time in almost 90 years that a fish could have swum that whole length of river. And we've been seeing through the microchip fish, because in every single one of those structures we've got a detection system. Some of those fish are now performing several 100-kilometre migrations, so we're seeing them go back to what they used to do. The challenge now is to replicate that up the Darling and some of the tributary streams. So you've got the Murray sorted. Now let's get the other main channels sorted. But fishways well designed. If they're well designed and well built, work quite well.
All right. So how do they actually work? How do the fish get in there and go over that hurdle?
Yeah, so it basically, I mean, if you think you got a 5-metre high weir and you've got water pouring over the top of that weir, that's too big a jump for most of our native fish. So what you do is you build this little concrete channel on the side, and it's got little baffles in it which break that 5-metre high stop into steps, and you make that steps. We tend to make them at about 10 centimetres, 10 or 15 centimetres, and it helps. The fish can get up that no problems. So it's basically just taking a big waterfall and turning it into a series of little waterfalls that help the fish. That's as simple as it is. So
that's pretty cool. It kind of reminds me the images you see of the salmon and the trout in Canada darting up their rivers. It's a similar kind of thing by the.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and it's particularly good. I mean, it helps fish recover from poor water quality events. I mean, one of the main reasons the way fish will get back up the Darling is through fish ladders. And if we see black water events happen in the Murray all the time, one of the way those fish get back to those affected areas is through the fish ladders. And if the fish ladders weren't there, the fish wouldn't have any way to do it unless there was a major flood.
Is there any kind of modelling when you do your fish numbers and modelling how many fish are actually using the fish ladders? Because I know you've got data around those ones that are tagged. And I know a lot of modelling extrapolates from that kind of data collection. Have you got any idea of just how many fish do move?
Well, it really varies because fish move seasonally. So we see big movements between September and December. That's the big migration season. It can be a couple of. It's funny as you see a couple of fish. Can be a couple of fish per day one week, and next week, look, it happens at Turrumbry Weir. You'll see 10,000 juvenile silver perch go through overnight.
Wow! So
it's like that. I mean, Martin Mallenkirby saw 3,000 yellow belly going through Euston Weir in a single day. So when the fish are on, they're on. So yeah, it really depends on the time of year, the flows in there. We tend to see it's related to temperature and flow, really. So that's what happens. Yeah.
So we've spoken about tagging fish and microchipping and relocation. What about water quality monitoring? Can you tell us what's been done in the past and what's happening now, and possibly I've got some ideas what we can do in the future. So can you tell us what's happened in the past with water quality testing?
There's stations set up across the basin to do basic things like temperature and river flow, and but it found it a little bit harder to get things like dissolved oxygen. These are the things that really affect fish. When the oxygen gets low, the fish start dying. There was, I guess, there was a commitment, and the planning's still underway to get a monitoring system established through parts of the basin, but it just hasn't happened so far. So a lot of the water quality monitoring is manual. People go out and do it and measure it, and that's a time-consuming process. And sometimes you don't get the data quick enough to catch the bad spots.
There's people, very clever people with technology and coding, have got this idea now, where similar to a downrigger on boat where a bomb drops down on a cable down to a desired depth, and it has all those sensors on it, similar to the probes that you see on social media and magazines and whatnot, where they're dropping that probe down from a cable by hand. Now people are starting to get this idea where they can tow this probe, roll it behind them, and it takes a reading every 30 seconds. And that cable goes to a unit similar to a fish finder on their boat, and that's Wi-Fi to their phone, and that information is then sent over the network. And if they're out of range, it stores on their phone, and when they come back in range, then they switch it to online mode and uploads all that data that they collect through that day. That the goal, I know these group of people do, is automate it as much as possible so that the fisher or citizen scientist doesn't have to worry about doing all that kind of keep staying on top of that. You mentioned there was someone in the States, I think, when we were on the phone the other day. What have they got in mind?
Yeah, a colleague of mine invented this underwater robot. You basically stick it on this underwater system that's got an automated diver. It's got a whole bunch of probes. It's got a cable which goes back to an antenna, and it just randomly swims around in the weir and records all the different parameters at different depths.
Wow!
So that they put that in some of their dams in America where they know that the water quality is going to go bad.
Yeah,
and that gives them real-time data on what's happening in the weir pools. It'd be really cool to see a few of them put over here.
That's what we're working towards. And I can see an explosion of technology in water management, in fisheries management, and everyday fishers are going to be the ones driving it, where we can collect that data in real time and then can respond to it very, very quickly with whatever resources or management. We've got a question here for Benita Brown saying, how do you think rec fishers can use their intimate understanding and knowledge about their fishery and be regarded by government as serious stakeholders in water management? It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a good one.
Oh, it's a mouthful, and it's a really good question.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a funny thing because I do a lot of work over in the Mekong River.
Yep.
And in the Mekong River, and I'll get back to the Murray Darling, but I'll say is that the local ecological knowledge and the fisher knowledge is the main way that they get data on the fishery and feed that back into their management practices. The people are out fishing every single day. And so not much happens over there without consulting the local fishers first. You go in and say, well, what fish do you catch? When do you catch them? Have you seen any declines in the fish? And the first snapshot you get of that fishery is by talking to local fishermen. And it just doesn't seem something that we do too much over here. It's always something that seems to be really difficult. But I mean, I know myself, I can't be doing research on every single river every year. I mean, there's only one of me, and there's not that many more of us scientists around who are out doing it. Yet we've got this army of fishermen or fishers who are out every weekend fishing, doing things, who have, not only do they have information they can share, they want to share it, and they want to see that put into decision making. I guess over the last couple of years, it's the biggest shift I've seen towards to seeing fishers and also Indigenous, to get the cultural perspective, to being invited onto panels, being invited on. It wasn't happening 10 years ago. It certainly wasn't happening 20 years ago. So I hope that in 10 years from now, it's such common practice that we just do it by, it's automatic. It's got to become automatic.
Yep.
It's got to become part of what we do. Because you just can't be everywhere. But when there's people who are everywhere, why not use it? It's a resource.
And that's one thing we want to do, the national peak body and our member organisations. We want to create a national citizen science program that has so many different projects underneath it. And this is really good one. Like, there's so many passionate fishers in the basin area that want to contribute, and we can do pilots and fine tune it, and the really interested people that want to adopt it straight away, we get them kicked off, and then their friends see them do it, and all of a sudden that becomes just the usual thing as they're out doing their fishing, so, or just having fun out on the water. So I can see in the next year or two when we really start to get serious around a national rec fishing citizen science program. I see the basin going to be a huge part of
It's people are just so connected to their fish.
Yeah.
Fishers are so connected to their fish, but basin communities are so connected to their fish. It's something that's probably not as recognised as it should be, but it's hard to explain. But it's such a part of people's way of life who lives in the basin. You go fishing to get away from stress. You go fishing to have fun with your mates. You go fishing to spend time with your families. It's if you read the basin plan, if I was to say that, I mean, a lot of people can talk about what the flaws are in the basin plan, is that from a fish perspective, it's way too ecological. It says you need fish for biodiversity. Well, people need fish for their mental health. People eat fish. People go out for stress, for social interaction. There's so many benefits from a healthy fishery just to people who live in the basin, but that's not recognised. So we need to get that recognised, because people vote and people go fishing.
Well, hopefully the fantastic results that are coming out of the National Rec Fishing Survey, I've been privy to some of the stuff coming out of that, and what you just said, the results, I think you'll be surprised just how much people rely on fishing for their mental health, their physical health, food, interaction, family, friends, fishing clubs, competition, local economies. It has a huge impact, and I can't wait for those announcements. So before we were on air, we spoke about one of the hardest things fishers try to get their head around is the long list of agencies of who does what, who makes the decisions to release water for environmental flow, and fishers just seem to be the last people to find out when these decisions are made. Can you kind of shine a light on just one or two of the major agencies that make these calls, or how does that actually work?
Oh, it's such a very complex process, and it varies across the basin. I mean, there's different areas do it way better than other areas. There's annual planning processes which go in. I mean, various government agencies come together and say, how much water have we got in a given year? Where can we realistically put the water? What sort of benefits can we get? And one of the tricky things is that fish are only one beneficiary of the water, because you're also trying to give water bird breeding events and tree events. And so being a water manager, as easy as it is to pick on what they do, it's a really hard job, because you've got a lot of people to keep happy, and you're not going to keep them all happy. So where can fishermen get into the role? Well, there's some good examples of where it happens. I mean, in the Edward Wacool, in the Edward Wacool down near Deniliquin, the anglers even organise themselves in the Edward Wacool Angling Association to try and have a better voice. I mean, it's easier to speak to one group than it is to speak to 100 fishermen. And so they actually formed themselves into a group and injected themselves into discussions. And now they are actually actively having a say in how water's delivered down there. So, that's probably the best case model. There's other models where they just aren't developed that well. So, I know the government wants to do better at it, and they need to do better at it. And it's like I said before, it's a process that needs to be gone through. It's getting better, and I think in 10 years' time, we're going to be a lot better at it than we are right now.
We got
But you're asking the right questions, and don't let up. If you want to have your say, don't let up. Keep being the mosquito.
Yeah, well, you're not going to be heard unless you're in the room. So right. I'm a big one on that. We got a comment by Tony Bennett saying water trading is the biggest problem, I believe. I'm not anti-farming, but I do believe if you don't own a farm, no one should be able to purchase water license. Water trading, like I mentioned earlier there, my folks had water rights, and I'm not an expert in that, but you know much about water trading and what the go is there? I know Helen from the Shooters Party was right into that. What's the go with it?
I'm not an expert on water trading, and I won't pretend to be.
Yep.
And when I read the documents that talk about water trading, you need, wow, it takes a long time to get your head around them. But I mean, you see the opinions and you see everything, and you go, it must be hard. I mean, you think water should be used to grow things, not traded as a commodity.
Yeah.
It gets really tricky when you get into that space. I don't understand it, to be honest with you. I could tell you how to deliver water to get a fish breeding event or to get fish to move,
Yep.
but when it comes to that level of economics and things, wow, it's a whole different level.
Yeah. It's a complex system. Stewie Black says, can you tell us, tell all of us, as being an expert, will our river ever be what it once was?
Well, but there was I had a couple of slides, but I won't present them tonight. But there was a study in 1915,
yep.
right? And I always talk about this study. It wasn't even a study. In fact, here's a bit of inland fish history. In 1915, the New South Wales government set up a project, and it was called the utilisation of Mother Nature's waste. That was the name of the project. And what they noticed was that, particularly in the Bidgie, every year that the river would flood, the Bidgie would flood.
Yep.
And then when the water dropped down, all these billabongs were full of fish.
Yep.
And birds would go in and eat the fish, and then the billabongs would dry up, and then all the fish would die. And they said, well, that's Mother Nature's been extremely wasteful. So what they did is they paid this team of guys. They got them a really old truck, a couple of tanks, and there was 2 blokes. They got them a few nets, and they spent a couple of years just dragging the wetlands, putting the fish in tanks, and at that stage driving them up to the newly constructed Burrinjuck Dam. So they said, rather than let them die in a wetland, we'll send them up. Now, what these guys didn't realise was they wrote down what they were catching.
Yep.
And they were giving us a pretty rare snapshot of what the river was 100 years ago, a little over 106 years ago today. So they said they would scoop the net once and get over 100,000 fish. Now, that's 100,000 native fish. Murray cod, silver perch, golden perch, southern pygmy perch, southern purple spotted gudgeon, olive perchlet, smelt, hardyheads, you name it. These billabongs were absolutely teeming with fish. So, and I think one of the reasons they were doing that was because of this flooding and wetting. So these wetlands were getting wet every couple of years. And so these were pretty important nursery habitats. This is before all of the weirs started to get built. You go to those same places today, you're guaranteed to catch carp, goldfish, and weatherloach, and probably a few redfin. And so it's got a long way to go to get back to there. Now, the question is, how far back to that state can we get it? So if that's what it used to be, how far back can we get? Now, we're doing all the right things. We're reinstating fish movement. That's important. We're starting to put habitat back in the river. I mean, back in those days, they were still removing snags because snags were getting in the way of boats, paddle steamers and stuff. So they were better out of the river than in. You know, it's death by 1,000 cuts for fish when you look at all the things that were done. There's no commercial fishing anymore. But one thing, particularly for these little fish, is that they're simply not there. Some of the fish we haven't seen for 50 years in areas where they used to get hundreds of thousands of them. So I know there's a lot of effort now into breeding and reintroduction of those little guys. And if those little guys take off, it'll be really good. So in my expert opinion, I think we're doing all the right things. I can't say how far we'll get between now and where we were in 1915. It depends a lot on how much we invest and how much we get everyone involved in the rehabilitation over the next 10 to 15 years.
I really hope we do. I remember my father telling me a story of his father in Wentworth, and there was passengers on one of the paddle steamers. And when my grandfather was a kid, the passengers on the paddle steamer flick a coin off the side of the paddle steamer into the water, and my grandfather would dive in, dive to the bottom, and could see the coin clearly all the way at the bottom, and bring it back up, and the passengers would let him keep the coin. And people that know Wentworth and junction there and how turbid the water is at any given time, but this was, I'm not sure when the lock was built there, 1967 I think, I don't know, I could be wrong, but that was a time where the Murray and the Darling were meeting together and it was flowing clear. So I long for the day we see that.
It'd be awesome if we see that. One thing we need in the river to be able to do that is water. So it's not a river without water. And so I think we've still got a long way to go to getting flowing rivers that are going to be able to support fish. And if there's one thing that fish need to survive, it's water.
Yeah.
And we need more water in the rivers. So
we've got Benita Brown says, please ask Lee if he would support a movement for water release to be timed to fishing events and competitions, because that's what keeps many basin communities going. Communication is key. Oh, that's a great point. What's your thoughts on that, Lee?
Well, it kind of cuts back to this whole ecological sort of argument. I mean, fish are more than just the ecology. They're a way of life for people. And so if you say to people, we want to start delivering water for the benefit of fishers, it'd be a wonderful thing to do. So let's start doing it. The challenge is getting that injected into the decision-making process and working. I mean, we've seen a big shift over the last 10 years. Most of the fishing now is catch and release, let's face it. Not too many. I mean, some people keep it for a feed for their families, which is fine. But you don't see the poaching that was going on 25 years ago. And you certainly see a lot of people just taking photos and putting fish back. And so the impact anglers are having isn't that big. One thing I will say, though, is we quite often saw down on the Murray that we'd be microchipping fish and we'd see anglers catching fish off they'd be catching fish all sorts of places when the river goes up. So, but other days we'd be catching fish and they wouldn't be. So I think we still have a lot to learn about when fish are on the bite and when they're not on the bite, and when they're moving, are they biting? But it's a great suggestion, and it's a good way to inject fishermen into the discussion. Yep. Yeah, why not?
Why not? I'll say to our viewers, if you got more questions, keep them coming, because we're nearly at the end of our a bit of an outline here. But we've got something special, and I'm really keen on this. The grad certificate for fish conservation and management. Can you tell us about what this is? I'm super keen to hear what this is.
Well, I kind of, for us, it's a little bit about giving back, because, as a fisher, that I got to start a few years ago because I was at uni, and once I tasted what the fisheries field was like, I just loved it. And I know a lot of people I speak to, they will say, "Oh, you got the best job in the world," and in many ways, I think that I do. And so, one thing that at the time, there was no real fish courses that you could study that gave you a grounding in fish. And so I kind of drew on my love of fishing, and also just annoyed people who were working in the fisheries field to try and find opportunities. But these days it's a bit more competitive, and we thought that there's two reasons. One, there's no real course that gives you anything for fish, so we developed one. At Charles Sturt Uni. It's going to be starting this year as our first year. And it's going to be really about, it's a 6-month course where you can get an understanding of fish, and also we'll work with people to sort of build their understanding of how fish move, why they move, and how you could fix it up. So for us, it's a bit of giving back, but it's also recognizing that there's going to be some pretty big investments in fish over the next 10 years. And so there are going to be jobs around, and there's also going to be a need for trained community members to join panels. I've never seen, like I said before, in 10 years, that the amount of interest in getting fishermen involved. And so passing on a bit of the knowledge of what we've learned over the last 20 years working in the basin, we thought it's a good way to give back to people who've helped us. I mean, we've had a great relationship with fishers over the years. They give us a lot of data, and we want to give a bit back. So I
can really see the next generation of leaders and managers. They'll look at this grad certificate and hopefully very quickly can turn that into a own degree. But I think it's such an important bit of education that we can get our next generation of leaders in that are so passionate about it. I think, what is it? You kind of got planned 10 Aussies per year at the moment. Is that what you're shooting for?
Yeah, we're trying to pull together some funding for some scholarships so that we can. I mean, if we started to get 10 through a year, that'd be amazing, because we really wanted to start people who are really interested in leading community-based projects. Like, do you want to run a river breach rehabilitation program, or sort of join a government panel that's making decisions about this? We wanted to give people a grounding in that sort of stuff so that they could, walking in blind, you've got a little bit of a background. That can help. So
we got a question here from Stewie Black again. Do you think getting involved with tagging should be made a lot easier in every state.
Oh,
I've got a
yep.
bit of knowledge about that. Tagging's more difficult to kick off in some states than others. Legislative requirements. Is that correct?
Look, in terms of in terms of tagging programs, of course we need more, because they generate such good information. One of the tricky things is that under sort of legislation is considered a surgical procedure,
Yep.
so you have to have a little bit of training, and so that's the other thing we're doing, is starting to get some training going, because if you tag fish the wrong way, they can die pretty quickly. Right. And so that's the downside of a tagging program. So if you've got fish tagging, people tagging fish properly, it's really good. You don't want to stress out a fish unnecessarily. But that said, tags are relatively inexpensive, and it's not that hard to kit people up to go out and do it.
Yep. So. Awesome. I suppose there's one more discussion point, and I wasn't sure if we were going to get to it. We've got enough time. We're at 49 minutes. Misinformation, and I know on our phone call a few days ago, we didn't really touch on it, but can you tell me, what did you mean by misinformation?
It's like anything, you know. It's one thing I've learned. You quite often hear, you hear stories of, they're like tales that have sort of been propagated, that are myths that need to be busted, and that's one thing that we were hoping the course would do, was try and bust some of those myths. But there's a lot of information around what, I mean, you can go on any site and find people say, why do we deliver environmental water? Environmental water doesn't work. When as a scientist who's worked in that field for 10 years, I've seen the benefits of environmental water. I've seen how it can save fish from black water events. I've seen how fish can spawn from it. I've seen how it can move larvae and eggs around. And so when people come out and say the environmental water is terrible and it's not having a benefit, I can tell you, environmental water is benefiting fish significantly. Yeah. And in some areas, fish are getting water they need that they would otherwise have not got. So, things like that. There's a lot of misinformation around, and it's one thing that as scientists we don't do particularly well, is share the knowledge we have, and it's something we have to get a lot better of, because we publish our scientific papers and things. What we need to do more is more tackle box talks, more going to fishing club nights and disseminating the information to people, or making it more accessible to people, so that they so we don't get these myths, so that a lot of the fact is just there and people accept it.
Yep. So. Well, hopefully we can do that. So I hope Assistant Minister Dunham and Minister Susan Ley are hearing us, because rec fishers really want to participate in huge citizen science program and doing all the communication side of that, where we can get people that are really good at communicating science communication and getting to these groups at Australia, really kick off great initiative. Get that data, and then as a community and a co-management arrangement, make good decisions. So and see the benefits from it. I can't see any more questions from our viewers. So I don't know. I haven't really got anything else to say. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up at all, Lee?
I don't know. I was looking at Stewie Black's comment about saying it was a bad thing. I never said it was a bad thing for fish tagging. I think it's a good thing. Yep. We should do more of it, but we need to do it properly. Yep. And there's plenty of worldwide citizen science programs where anglers are tagging fish, and that's producing seriously good data. Yep. That's helping to manage the fishery. So absolutely need to do it. We just need to have easier processes for people to be able to do it. That's the trouble at the moment, is it's so hard. If you want to do a prove a tagging process or a tagging program, the process to go through it would frustrate the hell out of you. So you've got to try and make it a bit easier for people to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope we can do it. Well, thanks very much for being with us tonight, Lee. I really looked forward to this episode. I had flashbacks of living back in St. Raja as you're speaking about those areas, places like Houston. I'd spent a lot of time in Houston and Robinvale as well. So it's been great thinking about it. And as a kid, camping up Darling and pushing up into the Nindi and whatnot. So it's been a blast.
No, it's really good, and we've got a really special fish community across the basin. I mean, we're heading up to Menindee next week, actually, which is going to be pretty special to go out there and see what it's like 2 years after the fish kills. But I guess the one thing I can see, if there's still people online, is just to say we need to get the message out there about how important fish are. We need to talk about the importance of fish. So the cultural and indigenous perspectives, but they sustained communities on the river hundreds of years ago. We need to talk about the mental health aspects and the social benefits of fish, and we need to get that stuff embedded in the basin plan. I mean, we need to get metrics to say, well, why can't we say, well, the great Bonnie's message earlier. Okay, so let's have a flow release and a fishing competition, but let's measure over time how the fishermen are responding. Are they getting better catches because of it? You know, wouldn't that be a great metric to say we've been delivering flows for 10 years and fishermen catches have increased tenfold, 20-fold, I don't know, whatever it does. You know, so just thinking differently about the way we measure stuff could get things. But unless we get the decision makers to care about fish, and unless we get the people who are signing off on funding programs to care about fish, we're not going to get anywhere. So that the biggest thing we can do is keep telling people how wonderful fish are, how important they are to basin communities, and get decisions made that are going to benefit it, because they are very important.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much, Lee, and thanks everyone for watching tonight. And next week we're not having an episode because Tacklebox is actually on site in South Australia in Victor Harbour and in the Coorong. We've got two events that the Tacklebox project is actually involved in with citizen science. But the week after, we have Cass from Ozfish, and she's going to be speaking to us about riparian zones. What are they good for? And the little things that are in riparian zones that affect your fishing a great deal. So knowing what is going on in those zones will help your fishing go along. So until then, good luck, tight lines, and thanks very much, Lee.